Welcome back to the Advocacy and Water Protection in Native California Summer Speaker Series and Certificate Program. I'm really happy to see all of you here today. We're currently in our second module titled Culture, Advocacy, and Environmental Justice. My name is Kaitlin Reed. I'm an assistant professor of Native American Studies at Humboldt State University and a member of the Yurok tribe. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Before we dive into the program, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to all of you from Wiyot lands today. Wiyot peoples continue to remain in relationship to these lands through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. They are important parts of not only the history of this area, but in the continuing knowledge of this place, the future of this place. If you don't know whose land you're on right now, I encourage you to go find out, educate yourself about the history of the place you live, familiarize yourself with the work that those tribal peoples are doing and how you can support that work. But I have something that is on the docket right now that is kind of urgent that we need all of the water protectors on the call to be aware of. Last Thursday, July 16th, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, voted 3-0 to partially transfer the license of the 4 dams to the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, the KRRC. That's the dam removal entity. However, they required that PacifiCorp, which is the current owner and operator of the dams, they currently have to remain a co-licensee. So this means that the dams have not been fully transferred to the dam removal entity. And so from the state's perspective, it is kind of unclear what is happening with dam removal. PacifiCorp has said repeatedly and in a statement recently that protecting its customers from dam removal costs is, quote, a bedrock principle, and it has been from the beginning. And so essentially FERC's decision denies PacifiCorp's customers the protections that a company negotiated for, right? And so, like, we all know PacifiCorp only wants to get rid of the dams because FERC relicensing is expensive, right? They're not doing this out of the kindness of their heart. And so now the protections they've created for their customers are no longer in effect because PacifiCorp is still a co-licensee on dam removal. So we need everybody to start writing letters to all of their local newspapers, their editors, which essentially state that, hey, PacifiCorp, this is not some optional thing you get to choose to do. You've made a commitment to Klamath River peoples, and you need to follow through on this commitment. So I encourage all of you to go follow the Save California Salmon action alert list is what they call it. And so they will be sending out an action alert. They'll provide all of the information that I've just given you now, but a little more in depth. And it'll have specific information about where we need support, where we need letters sent, where, like, who we need to tag in social media posts, where donations can be made. So go follow, sign up for the Save California Salmon's action alert list, check their websites for their action alerts, and then sign the petition on change.org. Save California Salmon is committed to not send you emails more than a couple times a month, and they will not share your information, but it is a great way to stay educated on what is happening with dam removal. So go follow them, read the action alert, and give support today. All right, so that is my thing I needed to make sure I told you about. If you have any questions during the duration of the panel, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature on Zoom. We will get to your questions around the end, probably around like, we'll try to get to them around like 1:10 and have a solid 20 minutes for discussion. And a few housekeeping notes. Please do not forget to fill out your evaluation forms. If you registered for the certificate program, you receive an evaluation form. These help us to do better in future webinars, but it's also how we check attendance and verify your attendance. So if you want a certificate, make sure you fill out the evaluation form. Additionally, I want to remind people that if you've missed a core course or any of the electives that you are interested in, all of the talks in this webinar series thus far have been recorded and posted to the HSU NAS YouTube page. Our channel is HSU NAS, lowercase, no spaces. All right, let's get to it. I'm very excited to moderate today's panel discussion called The River Feeds Us, Food Sovereignty and Community Resilience. Today, our panel is going to examine the centrality of Indigenous relationships to food systems and the importance of food sovereignty for tribal nations. Additionally, we'll reflect on the ways in which Native peoples are currently working towards food sovereignty. in their respective areas and how these goals are critically interconnected with water policy in California. We have a highly esteemed panel of presenters for you today. I'm going to briefly introduce all of them right now, but I encourage our panelists to say a few more words about themselves as you begin your presentation if you would like to. Our first speaker today will be Hillary Renick. She is an alumni of the Indigenous Food Initiative at the University of Arkansas as an LLM fellow in agriculture and food law with support from First Nations. She received her JD from the University of the Oregon School of Law with certificates of completion in environmental and natural resources, ocean and coastal law, pro bono, and public service. She was a research assistant for Professor Mary Christina Wood, researching nature's trust and public trust doctrine as it relates to climate change, while working with Oregon's 9 tribes on water and environmental related issues. She also completed graduate studies in cultural resource management as a Bureau of Reclamation Fellow at Central Washington University, successfully defending her master's thesis on Yakima Indian treaty fishing and significance of traditional places. She studied public health at George Washington University, assisting Dr. David Goldsmith with his research on Native American health problems associated with exposure to agricultural pesticides in agriculture and during artifact repatriation. Hillary received her BA in anthropology from American University in Washington, D.C., and is an enrolled member of the Sherwood Valley Band of Pomo Indians and descendant of the Hopeland Chanel Noyo River Indian and Fort McDermott Paiute Shoshone communities. I hope I said all of your communities right, Hillary. Hillary's work is focused on land, air, water, cultural resources, and traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering protections. Oh, wow, what an array of accomplishments. Our second speaker is Megan Baldy. Megan is the Klamath Trinity Resource Conservation District Coordinator. She is a Hoopa tribal member and resides on the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation in Northern California. She is the coordinator of a tribal nonprofit established under the Hoopa Valley Tribe's Sovereign Business Codes, and the KTRCD promotes food security within homes and food sovereignty initiative within the tribe and reservation boundaries. I will also just briefly say Megan has an amazing YouTube channel that I love watching, Cooking Healthy in Indian Country, that everybody should go watch. It's phenomenal. And our final speaker today is Cody Hendrickson. He is of the Outer Inlet, Dena'ina, and Sugpiaq descent and an enrolled member of the Ninilchik Village Tribe in the Great Land of Alaska. Cody is a senior undergraduate at Humboldt State University, double majoring in marine biology and Native American studies with a focus in Indigenous food sovereignty. Cody is a member of the steering committee for Humboldt State University's Indigenous Food Sovereignty Lab and is an active participant in its creation. His passions for the ocean, food sovereignty, and his tribe have led him to professional goals of creating and managing marine aquaculture systems in his home state of Alaska. Cody hopes that in doing so, he may provide economic growth, stability, and a source of food sovereignty and research opportunities for his people and his community. Oh, cool. I'm very excited for today's panel. But I'm going to talk just a little bit longer at all of you. And I'm going to briefly introduce the concept of what Indigenous food sovereignty means for people who are unfamiliar with that term. And this way our presenters can just dive straight into the work that they do without having to explain what food sovereignty is. So let me share my screen with you all. This is our lovely poster for today. First things we need to talk about is settler colonialism and Indigenous foods. Native peoples had an amazing knowledge of how to harvest, gather, collect, and steward food sources. And we had very important relationships with our food sources. Okay, this idea of like nomadic hunter-gatherer, like walking around just grabbing a berry here and a berry there, right, is very simplistic. It depicts Native peoples as primitive, and this helps justify land dispossession, right? In reality, Native peoples had complex knowledge systems about how to work with food systems. So as a part of settler colonialism, which is a structure designed to dispossess Indigenous peoples of their lands and then create the new owners of that land, right? Attacking food sources was incredibly important. And so this helps explain why Indigenous peoples need to reconnect with food sources. And so there's the deliberate and unintentional destruction of Indigenous food sources. If you eliminate a people's ability to feed themselves, they become dependent, right? And so the US military was given orders to systematically eradicate buffalo, right? Not all destructions of indigenous food sources was as clearly deliberate, because this is like they got an order from the US military. There's not much more deliberate than that. But also unintentional destructions, right? So when miners show up in California, when the Spanish missionaries show up in California, they bring a ton of livestock that have hooves that completely destroy all of these roots and tubers and bulbs and plants that we depend on as food species, right? And so food is destroyed in multiple ways. Some of it is deliberate and intentional in a form of genocide. Some is unintentional by the economic activities that settlers want to do in this new place. Okay. Additionally, land dispossession via removal, allotment, and relocation prevents Native peoples from accessing their food sources. When the reservation systems were originally created, it was illegal to leave the boundaries of the reservation, right? Our food sources don't give a shit about political boundaries you draw on a map. Herds migrate, right? Like plants move, right? And so leaving the reservation was a crime. You then became a hostile. It was legal to kill you. And the biggest reason we left reservation boundaries was to get to food sources. In the 20th century, you see programs like relocation and boarding schools that are further separating Native peoples from their traditional food sources. Imposition of Western agriculture. Many Native peoples were tremendous agriculturalists, right? If we hadn't been, all the settlers on the eastern seaboard would have died, right? Like they were starving when they showed up. But many tribes didn't do Western style agriculture, right? And they were adept fishers, hunters. And here in California, we would burn all the time, and people call that like a proto-agriculture. But the state also wanted to impose Western agriculture, like Protestant ideals, right? The yeoman farmer. In other ways, they interfered with the transfer of food-related knowledge. When students were sent off to boarding schools, they weren't learning where their traditional hunting spots were, where their traditional fishing spots were, what all the recipes were, what are the relationships you're supposed to have with these foods. So that also worked to sever this relationship. And then environmental change, the damming of rivers, preventing salmon from reaching their ancestral territories, flooding of native lands, right? We call native lands sacrifice lands, so that places are flooded so other places can have the things they want, right? Like all of the Winnemucca lands are like underwater so that Los Angeles can have drinking water. Industrial contamination that prevents us from accessing traditional foods, but also when we put it into our bodies, it perpetuates violence through contamination. And climate change. Our food systems are changing now because of climate change. The flows in rivers are changing, right? Ice caps are melting, etc. So as the availability of foods declined, so too have the stories, the languages, the cultural practices, interpersonal relationships, and outdoor activities implicated in those food systems. So when we talk about reclaiming foods, it's not just about the food, right? It's about the stories, the language, and the cultural practices that go with that. Okay, so what is food sovereignty? It is first defined in 1996 by La Via Campesina. They're an international group of small-scale farmers who want to articulate a common response to neoliberalism and the domination of market economies. Okay, and then in 2007, the Forum for Food Sovereignty, this definition of food sovereignty is further refined and developed. 80 different countries adopt the Declaration of Kaitlin, which includes the following definition. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own system and agricultural systems. And a really important part of food sovereignty is is the production of food, right? So in a lot of different documents, you'll see people have the right to access of food, right? Like access can mean a lot of different things. Access can mean one multinational corporation is making all of the food and you just have access. Food sovereignty is really ownership and determination over how food is produced, where, when, by whom. And so what is indigenous food sovereignty and how does that differ? The first thing I will recommend is this text, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States, Restoring Cultural Knowledge, Protecting the Environment, and Regaining Health, edited by Maheshua and Hoover. It has numerous chapters from practitioners all over the United States. Excellent resource if you want to go educate yourself more on indigenous food sovereignty. I'll just very briefly, Indigenous food sovereignty refers to a reconnection to land-based food and political systems that seek to uphold sacred responsibilities to nurture relationships with our land, culture, spirituality, and future generations. According to Carla Ray Rudolph and Stephane McLaughlin, Indigenous food sovereignty explicitly connects the health of food with the health of the land and identifies a history of social injustice as having radically reduced Indigenous food sovereignty in colonized nations. Indigenous food sovereignty can also be thought as a framework for exploring the right conditions for reclaiming the social, political, and personal health we once experienced prior to colonization. The concept of Indigenous food sovereignty is not only focused on rights to land and the ability to control a production system, but also responsibilities to and culturally, ecologically, and spiritually appropriate relationships with elements of those systems. So an Indigenous sovereignty, food sovereignty centers responsibility and relationships over just rights and access. And then the last thing, and then I will let our panelists take it away. This also comes from the book edited by Maheshwa and Elizabeth Hoover, 4 Principles of Indigenous Food Sovereignty. First, the recognition that the right to food is sacred. And food sovereignty is achieved by upholding sacred responsibilities to nurture relationships with the land, plants, and animals that provide food. Second is the day-to-day participation in Indigenous food-related action at all levels. That includes individual, family, community, and region. Indigenous food sovereignty is not something we only theorize about or only write about or only produce research about. Indigenous food sovereignty is something that is enacted and lived in a day-to-day life. Third, self-determination, or the ability of communities and families to respond to their needs for culturally relevant foods and to have the freedom to make decisions over the amount and quality of food that they hunt, fish, gather, grow, and eat. And fourth, legislation and policy support to reconcile Indigenous food and cultural values with colonialist law, policies, and mainstream economic activities. One of the elephant in the room is that many of the settler states' current policies and environmental objectives are mutually exclusive with practicing an Indigenous food sovereignty, right? If you build an oil pipeline under the river, you can't support your community with fish from that same river, right? And so a lot of these activities need to end, right? So that everybody can feed themselves, right? And we all know settler colonialism is inherently unsustainable anyway. It's not about if it's going to collapse, it's about when, right? And so we need to be prepared with our food systems for when empire falls. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our first panelist, Hillary. Go ahead and take it away.
Hi, thank you, Kaitlin and Regina for inviting me to be on the call today, talking about some things that are very dear to my heart. And I'm coming to you today from Mendocino County in the heart of Pomo country here. And I have my companion with me. I want to say hi.
Noah Kabushka from a private Potawatomi reservation in Kansas.
Yes, so you brought up some points, and I do have a presentation that I'm going to go over and actually hit some of those parts, Kaitlin, that you brought up. And I have a paper that is going to be released today that I'll send out to the group later on today. It's just doing the final edits that for publication that also addresses some of these issues. I can't hear you, so I'm assuming you can. So food sovereignty and community resilience, something that that's been near and dear to my heart for many years. Interestingly enough, having grown up in Northern California and having access to our traditional foods was not valued until after I was out of law school into the workforce. And so the way things work that I'm very blessed to be a part of is that now, 15 years out of law school, I'm able to work on traditional foods issues. The traditional foods, I do present a lot to audiences that don't really deal with tribes, that are often have stereotypical views of what tribes are, what we do, what we don't do. And very often we're stuck in the past. So I do a lot of education as I speak to growers, producers, attorneys, government folks, just people from the public. So traditional foods are the foods that sustained us for millennia. And it's not, we were never static. All of us, we traded, we had this beautiful balance of our traditional food. So one of the things that people don't understand today is and I'm not talking about our audience per se, but the idea of our people are from the reservations that we reside on now. It's true, many of us live within our Aboriginal homeland. However, our lands were always connected and interconnected with other tribes. And so we had this amazing trade network that went from the mega scale to, as you see on screen, the Dallas-Celilo trade area, which included Northern California. Our goods were traded up in that area, and again throughout Indian country. And so this intertribal trade network, these are like just two, samples of how that trade network spanned Native America. So we had these micro trade networks within, so say this area between, Pomo, eventually up to Yurok, Karuk country, all the way up to Klamath. Then from Klamath up to the Dallas-Celilo area, to Yakima, all the way up to Canada. And then inland, our abalone shells, our red abalone shells, have been found in archaeological sites in Wisconsin that are 12,000 years old. Last fall, I went to a site in North Dakota, and of course, what our beautiful Northern California ladies know is our beautiful earrings. There were the same earrings, abalone-shaped earrings in these archaeological sites of the Mandan and Hidatsa people. So we had this beautiful trade network. Our knowledge was shared, our science was shared, our food was shared. And so we had a complete palette. We had just all the nutrients that we needed, from taking the mussels, our seafood that had the iodine that is so important for brain development, and trading it inland to these other tribes. And here's the California area. So again, the importance of traditional foods, our culture, it's linked to our religion, the health and wellness. And the paper that should be coming out today from First Nations addresses just in this current state of the COVID crisis, how important traditional foods are, how important it is to know where your food comes from, to know, to have clean water quality, to be one with the land, and with the social distancing, just to go and harvest. Right now we have dried seaweed, the berries are out, we had deer meat this morning. So just the importance of the nutrition and the health of our people. And of course, the reciprocity and respect for the natural world. Again, the interconnectedness. I don't know how to emphasize this anymore, just how important land, air, water, culture, resources, sacred sites, our religion is so interconnected to our food. TEK, which is also, one of the terms that's thrown around a lot, but what does it really mean? Just that connection to our landscapes, our worldview, our medicines, the love for our land, and of course our native languages. There's some things, the love for our land, that are not able to be interpreted correctly using the English language, that mountain, but the mountain where people have lived forever, where people have been buried forever. Like how do you even use English language to convey the importance and the love for that? So as a Northern California tribal person, I have up on the right some holdings from cases. So, just a few of the cases that I really like and I always use in my writings. A treaty between the United States and an Indian tribe is essentially a contract between two sovereign nations. And, in this era of civil unrest or, just the language that's coming out, that's in the news, just to always remind folks that tribes, American Indian, Alaska Native tribes, we were sovereign nations. The United States does not have treaties with groups of people, with races, that we are sovereigns. So it is important that we maintain that connection to the land. So again, sometimes people will say, well, what do you want? Do you want to be called Indians or your tribe? Or, it's very complicated. But Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution states that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. So the term Indian in this instance is a legal term. And it shows that we are a sovereign. And this is the Commerce Clause that if you read any Indian law books and it references, this is the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. This is still good law. And this is part of everyday federal Indian law policy. And some of the things that I work on, government to government, what does that look like? Setting up tribal consultations with different federal agencies. I know Kaitlin mentioned FERC, Department of Energy, Corps of Engineers. It's just, one of the several different agencies and bureaus that tribes today deal with. So this is, I have, different pictures of different foods. The tubers that Kaitlin was talking about, how, our root crops, primarily, which are carbohydrates that come out in the fall, our acorns, our wild onions, our celeries, the things that sustain us right before we get, that help us make it through the winter. And then when we get that spring salmon run with that good, omega fat. This is one of my favorite holdings. It's U.S. versus Winans. It's on the Columbia River. It's a Yakima Warm Springs case. And it says, a treaty between the United States and the Indians is not a grant of rights to the Indians, but a grant of rights from the Indians, a reservation of those not granted. And so again, this is still good law. One of the holdings that I cite when I write. And it's just interesting to turn it on your head. As children, sometimes we're taught in school that, the United States gave reservations as like a pittance to tribes. And it's not entirely true for many different reasons. And hopefully some of this will spur some discussion after all of us do our presentations. Cultivated foods, again, California, we have many different eco zones, hunting, fishing, but also there was, we had the trade with the cultivated foods, the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash. To get to the removal era with the food commodities, I'm sure Megan probably talk about a little bit about the Food for the program. And then the Dawes Act, the assimilation policies of the United States, so federal Indian law sometimes is portrayed as like a domestic violence situation. It's like, I hate you, like removal, taking our children, putting them in boarding school. Then it's like, I love you, which is, okay, well, we were gonna, open up your land for settlement, but, maybe we'll give you the benefit of the doubt and hold it in trust. The era of self-determination from the 70s is theoretically the era that we're still supposed to be in. Self-determination, how we 638 some of our programs from the United States government. This photo below is from Morongo. Just it's one of the government policies of trying to turn us into farmers, in an arid environment. So tribal sovereignty includes what I know Kaitlin in her presentation, she talked about self-determination. Under international law, Indigenous people do have a right to life. What does that right mean? It does mean, what do you need as a permanent homeland? You need water, you need clean water, right? There's no guarantee of like housing or what they call secondary rights, but we do need basic rights. So we need the right to have water, to have food, and then just to think about like what that means. So gathering, traditional foods, it means several different things to different people, right? On the left, we have people surf fishing for smelt, for the Pueblo people, gathering their corn, making cornmeal. Our gathering means different things to different people. And then our threats to traditional foods, of course, climate change, globalization, monoculture, water scarcity, and urbanization. And of course, our panelists will probably talk a little bit more about all of those points. And then I talked about self-determination. So these are, for folks wanting to get into federal Indian law or working with their tribes or for their tribes, these are some of the statutes and acts that we work with to try to promote and protect tribal sovereignty, letting different agencies, both probably at the state level and the federal level, that letting them know that Indian people, we do care about our land. We're going to intervene. It might be the headwaters, it might be in another state, but we do have a stake because it's all interconnected. And then tribal businesses, like what does that look like in this day and age? The paper that I'll send around later, I did 4 case studies. One's Yurok, the other one's Karuk. Then I did Yochadihi, which is in the Sacramento Valley, and Pomo Reservation. And just looking at, as California Indian people, how different our food sources look and what that means in the current era. So that's all I have for this. And so let the next speaker go.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hillary. That was wonderful. If folks have questions for Hillary, please put them in the Q&A feature now, and then all 3 panelists will answer questions at the end. Okay, so your Q&A button should be at the bottom, so you can use that for questions. Our next speaker will be Megan Baldy. Megan, whenever you're ready.
Hey, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. Thank you guys for having me on this talk. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Regina and Hillary, for setting this up. A lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is going to be a little redundant and, kind of basically touching bases on what Hillary was talking about and then what Kaitlin was also talking about. So we'll get into my presentation. Okay. Okay, so as mentioned before, I am also a Hoopa tribal member, and food sovereignty, the work that I do on the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation. So I'm just going to kind of go over the importance of food sovereignty as opposed to me as a Hoopa person, and where I've seen that the shift from our indigenous foods have shifted into this new system that we have. And so I want to just kind of touch bases on our history about food and where I see through my research our food system here in Hoopa is broke down. So we were called the Hoopa people in the 18th into our area, and we actually met with the youth, but our church is where the trail returns. And I talked to some linguistics professors in our area, just specifically our neighbors and stuff. And she told me it's kind of like there's no place like home. So that's what it means. And it's so true. I can go out of Hoopa and I just cannot wait to get home all the time because there's just no place like our area. So we're a Northern California tribe. We are the largest land-based tribe in California. We have 12 square miles, and that's roughly about 144,000 acres. The Hoopa people have been residing in California since time immemorial. I always like to point this out because my uncle, he is a self-governance coordinator here in Hoopa, and I always ask him questions, and I'll ask him, you know, when were the Hoopa people recognized? And he would say since the beginning of time. And then I'd be like, well, okay, so when did we, you know, become the Hoopa Valley tribe? And he said since time immemorial. And that really brings me back to a way of thinking that I really should be thinking, instead of like our definition being defined by the federal government of our reservation. We should really be saying, hey, you know, we've been here since the beginning of time. So for us, you know, our first contact was in 1850s, like I said, and that was during the gold rush. And, you know, there was nothing but local foods. There was a huge local food system and also a trading food system here. And so roughly the last 167 years since contact, our food system has seen devastating changes. And for the past 40 years, I believe we've seen some really, really devastating changes. So let's get started from the beginning. So our staple food source in 1848 was acorns. Like, you know, we are in Hoopa, we're surrounded by tan oak acorns all over the place. We do have some live and some black oak, but our staple source was the tan oak acorns. And I always like to put it in this perspective of like, if we were to think about it today and your kid was to come to you and say, hey, mom, what's for breakfast? And you would say acorns and berries. Mom, what's for lunch? Acorns and fish. Mom, what's for dinner? Acorns and deer meat. You know, it was that staple food that was served with pretty much every meal. Sorry, my screen's lagging. So this nut, it was a staple food, but it also is a superfood. There's properties within acorns that once you leach them, which you're leaching out the tannic acid in there, and also you're leaching out another acid, I forget the name, but once you're leaching that acorn, it starts to change the nutrient properties of it. And there's so much value in a leached acorn when it comes to what your body needs. Like it has vitamin D in there, calcium, proteins, and good fats, omega-3s and omega-6 fats. But it was just power packed with so much nutrients, and it was easily storable. You were able to get up and make acorns daily. It was part of the way of life for the Hoopa people. And so now another staple for us is our salmon. So most of the tribes in the villages in the Hoopa Valley area was located on the Trinity River. So the river was just no more than a few yards away from each one of the villages. And our salmon, you know, that was a huge staple food for us. So there's two different times of the year that we do our salmon harvest. We harvest in the early spring and in the early fall. And we traditionally use spears and built weirs and then netted fish out of the river. Due to the abundance of fish and acorns, the Hoopa Valley became known as a a trade center, like a world trade center. So, you know, we have inland abalone, and we have, we call it dentalium, that came from the coast. So all the coastal natives, they would come here and they would trade, you know, for acorns or for fish, all types of different things. This was just a hub of a food system here in Hoopa. We were just connected to the Karuk tribe, the Yurok tribe, the Talawat. We had a lot of tribes coming to our area. Other traditional foods that we have is our huckleberries and our gooseberries, our herbs like Indian tea, our mushrooms, and our eel. These were all something that, you know, we gathered during each time of the year. And so, you know, they're all staples, but they also were like different times of the season so that you had a wider range of different local foods. Our people weren't an agricultural based people. We were traditionally gatherers and fishermen, and that's just basically how our lifestyle was. You know, as you can see, the lady on the left, she has her burden basket, she's out collecting wood. And the man on the right, he's net fishing some salmon or some trout or whatever type of fish he would be pulling out of the river. Now, you know, you think about that, we were so rich in our food sources, and we're still rich in those food sources. It's not like the food has gone away. Yes, we've had issues with our salmon and the decline due to climate change and basically raping of our natural resources. But we still have those things widely available today. So I wonder where this like shifted in the early 2010s here, where I see a lot of people that are very food insecure. Recorded 25 Angle households in the valley. So these farmsteads were established to provide support to the miners. These families petitioned the federal government, and they basically said, we need troops over here. We're afraid of the Indian people here. We have fear that they're going to kill us. So they sent in the federal government, and they sent in soldiers, and they established Fort Gaston, which is still here today. In 1864, there was a successful resistance from the Hoopa people. Basically, the Hoopa people had endured some tragedies within their communities with these settlers, you know, basically doing what they wanted to do without any care of the Hoopa people, or even treating us like we were human beings. And so we actually resisted the federal government, and how we were able to do that is we went up into the forest, and we were able to feed ourselves with what was around and what was available. And these soldiers that had no understanding or no way to withstand the fight that they were putting on, you know, they had to come up with a negotiation, and Treaty of 1864 was established for the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation. I read stories about the federal government and the soldiers basically putting out sacks of flour for the Indian people to entice them down out of the hills. And they would come back, and the flour would be on the ground. There was some utility of that bag, as opposed to we established the 65, the white settlers were given a 10-day notice to leave the valley. Now, I've read that those 25ers gave them a huge amount of money, and you know, those were the first settlers that we had, and that was roughly, you know, 140 years ago, give or take. Now, this picture right here is at Fort Gaston, and it's 1877. And this picture really touches my heart and my soul, and it really makes me wonder, Gaston and waiting for rations. You know, I don't know the hardship, or, you know, them being so proud and so happy with their food system, that they must have been just so beat down, or just so you know, in such a state of distress that they had to go sit at Fort Gaston and wait there for their rations. If this doesn't hit you right in the heartstrings as a Native person, you know, there's many more. If you look up, you know, things from your tribe about, you know, having food rations given out to your people, you know, I suggest that you look at it so that you can understand, you know, why the importance of food sovereignty as a Native person is something that we need to be working on daily. And it needs to be a number one.
I hate to interrupt you, but the sound quality is really poor, and I don't think our
General Allotment Act, or the Jobs Allotment Act, is where they started giving people who farmsteads, right? So we got about 40 acres here in Hoopa per farmstead. And basically trying to assimilate the Native Americans, or the Hoopa people, into
Hey Megan, can you hear me?
being a farmer. So back then, yeah.
Hey, the sound on your end is pretty poor, and I don't think our audience can hear you, unfortunately. Why don't I share your PowerPoint, and then maybe if you don't have screen share on, your audio will have a little more impact. Okay, so I'm going to share your presentation, and hopefully then your audio will be a little bit better. Okay, is this the slide you were on right here? Is this the slide you're on, Megan?
Is my audio better?
Yeah, I can hear you a little bit better. And thank you everybody for being patient with us. Megan is joining us from Cuba today.
Okay.
Her internet might not be as good. Is this the slide you were on?
Yeah. So going over you know, the General Allotment Act. You know, basically for us, we were given 40 acres per allotment, and that was allowing us to, you know, begin farmsteads and start to begin farming in Hoopa. So I'll go next slide.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So agriculture became the way of life for Hoopa people. Many elders that I've talked to and grandparents remember having food cellars, canning pantries. Home preservation was a way of life. You know, in the 40s, Hoopa had established a cannery in Hoopa. The people were able to bring their farm goods and can them. So this is, you know, was the social networking back in the day. You know, I've talked to elders, and they said that they would be outside playing in the fields and doing whatever, and their moms, their grandmas, or their aunties were in, and they were canning in Hoopa. This is where I feel like in my local area where our food system began to really shift again is in the 1940s to 1980s, which was when our logging industry hit. And the logging boom was in Hoopa. You know, my grandfather wasn't a logger, and he was 14 years old when he began logging. And so, you know, I have kids that are 14 now, and I couldn't imagine them, you know, being a logger and doing that, but that's how it was. And those men, when they were logging, they made a pretty good revenue. And then, you know, the logging industry tanked. Next slide. you know, after the logging industry tanked, you know, I feel like, to me personally, that my opinion is that once that happened, that it became two income earning homes to make up for that income. So like back in when we did have the logging industry here, we had a roller skate rink, we had a movie theater, we had several stores, we had several diners here. And once that logging industry tanked, that economic development, or the economy tanked here in Hoopa. And so, like I said, I think that mom got out of the kitchen and we began to have latchkey kids. So, you know, I look back to back then, and how it must have been is that, you know, everybody had gardens, everybody canned everything, and then everything changed, and then now we are to where we are today. So about 6 years ago or so, our local raised food place, our local store, which was not a tribally owned store, actually had a large rat infestation. And the way that they were able to basically go on as the store there is that they paid the local county as a health inspector, but because that county had no jurisdiction on the Hoopa Valley tribe, they were able to pay for that and never have any type of inspection done. So, you know, once that store closed, there was a lot of people that were starving locally. Next slide. And then there's today's reality. You know, we do have our store back. We actually opened it up last year, but during the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of, you know, fear buying. A lot of people were going out and they were buying, you know, truckloads of food and stuff, and a lot of the shelves were bare. And not only was it the scare, but also those processing facilities began to shut down. And so I think about it when we go back into history, and like, let's just say even 50 years ago, when we had people more food secure back then than we are today, what have we, you know, what have we done to our food system to be having hungry people? I read a story in the 1964 flood that happened in Hoopa. The federal government flew food into Hoopa, and a lot of people did not pick up that food. Now, if you were to come into Hoopa today and you were to bring free food in today, there would be a line of people that would be lined up to get that food. So how is it that 50 years ago or so, when we had the flood, that we were more food secure then than we are today? In 2020, when we have Amazon, when we have all these different places that you can buy from and basically get your stuff the next day or the day after, how did we become so food insecure? And so as analyzing that and knowing the history, I began to think about how can we actually, you know, start to rebuild our food system. Next slide. So, you know, we talked about food sovereignty and the definition of food sovereignty, but bringing back the traditional staples. You know, our acorns and our fish and all those things, you know, they're very, very sacred to us. And, you know, we definitely consume them a lot during dance season and during our traditional ceremonies. But we also need to bring it back into a staple into our home. Like, we need to, you know, be having that, like, mom, what's for dinner tonight? Acorns and, you know, we're going to have a beef roast and some local veggies, you know, bringing back those traditional staples and teaching our kids how to use those. If you can press on to the slide so that the animation goes forward. So, you know, right here we have on the left, you can see we went to a culture camp and my sons actually taught how to dress a deer, bringing back that knowledge of the respecting of our animals and the dressing of our animals and how to properly butcher them. And so, you know, that's something that we like to teach all the time, is like how to properly handle an animal that you've harvested, how to harvest our salmon, and teaching our kids the importance of putting fish away every year and having that as a food source in our home. Harvesting acorns, you know, the importance of the nutrients and, you know, getting the kids into eating it so it's a part of their palate. It's not something that they try once in a while, it's something that they're eating all the time. Next slide. you know, food sovereignty is all about teaching each other, showing each other what our gifts are. And on the left, you can see this is Louisa McCovey. She is the tribal EPA for the Yurok tribe. And she is actually talking to a group of kids that we've hosted a youth event for kids in the Pacific region, which is California, Nevada, and Hawaii, with IAC, which is Intertribal Agriculture Council. All these kids came together last year in September, and basically we went all around to the local tribes and talked about their food system. But Louisa here, she's talking about mussels and harvesting mussels, and you know, the amount of research and the data that they're collecting at the Yurok tribe to make sure that those mussels are safe to gather and they're not full of, you know, chemicals or mercury or things that are harmful to Indian people. And I really, really like this picture for many reasons. One, she's got her baby on her back and she's working with her baby. And I think that's so important for us to bring back that, you know, type of lifestyle, that our kids should be right there next to us while we're doing these things, even if it's work, you know, even if it's their job. But you can see this rainbow coming off of her forehead, and she's like basically sharing all of her knowledge and giving out all her heart and soul into what she's doing to these kids, you know. And then also, you know, all these kids are just there and they're learning, and you know, it's just an awesome thing to see. I really enjoy that. On the right, my daughter, she's on the ground in a little pink shirt, and that's my sister, my little sister. And my daughter is actually teaching my little sister how to gather acorns. My sister, she lived out of the area for a long time and she's never gathered acorns. And so my daughter was actually sharing knowledge to her auntie on how to properly gather acorns and what you're gathering. Next slide. Again, you know, sharing with each other that knowledge. On the left, you see these are definitely kids that came from that food summit. And that's actually Donald Moore. He's actually my neighbor and my two sons, and he's teaching them how to put fish on sticks and how to do that. And that is super important. Like each one of our you know, age groups, mentoring the next generation and the importance of food and maintaining those traditional values, and that promoting that food sovereignty. In the middle, you can see that these kids are filleting and they're taking fish bones off. It's actually in collaboration with the Hoopa Valley High School. We were able to go in with them through their Hoopa and their Yurok cultural class and teach kids how to fillet fish properly, how to debone them. Once they filleted them and deboned them, I was able to teach them how to preserve that food, how to preserve that salmon. We've done so many projects with the local schools. It's something that the kids really enjoy. Also, the high school finally brought back their home economics room, which was long gone for a long time. So this room actually that we're in is the new home economics department. And then on the right are kids that they're basically foraging in the strawberry box at the community garden. That's always a hit. And we always get to teach the kids, like, you know, don't damage the plant. This is how you properly pick. And they're just super excited to go there and eat all the strawberries. Next slide. So this picture right here, I just wanted to share. It's one of my pictures that really, these two pictures really mean a lot to me. And I always, you know, say that food sovereignty is so important for the next generation, but also, you know, having people to buy in is way important to their food systems. I actually started at the community garden about 6 years ago. And when I started over there, I was actually next to, well, it's not there anymore, but there was a community day school there. And these kids actually have been school system and kind of been segregated because they had behavioral issues or they just weren't at the level that a lot of the kids were. And so they were next door and they loved to go to the garden. But one day I came to the garden and right before they had been there, we had planted these pumpkins with the kindergarten class and all the pumpkins were growing and we were super excited about like October coming and we're gonna have this like pumpkin patch adventure. And I went to the garden and all the pumpkins were destroyed and beat up and cut open, and basically tomatoes were thrown everywhere, and like my signs were broken, and I was like, oh my goodness, the kids next door, they got into the garden and look what they did. So I was like, I walked over there and I confronted them all, and I know all of them, I know all their families, so they know me too. And I said, I can't believe you guys did that to those babies' pumpkins like that, you know, and basically, you know, teared up and felt just like, come on guys, like, why would you do that? And so they felt bad. You can tell they all hung their heads and stuff. But, you know, I went back to the garden and I started to think like, you know, I could lock this garden up, but it's not going to stop anything. They'll just climb the fence. I could call the cops on them, but it's something probably that they've dealt with already. And then so I thought I can get them over here and I'm going to make them have ownership in this garden. And so all these kids went over and they built all these garden boxes and they shoveled the garden boxes in and we planted a bunch of stuff. And, you know, I made them plant eggplant and they're like, what the heck is this, Megan? I was like, it's eggplant. And I was like, I'll get you guys to eat it. You guys are going to try it. They're like, heck no, I ain't never going to try eggplant, Megan. You got to be crazy. I was like, I'll get you to try it. Just watch. So we harvested all the eggplant and bell peppers and, you know, just other items out of the garden. And we went to their classroom and I taught them how to make eggplant pizza sliders. And they're like, no way. So basically we cut everything up and then they were able to make each one of their pizza toppings onto their eggplant. And they were eating like 3 times and 4 times shares of those eggplant. And they really enjoyed it. And I said, see, I told you guys I'd get you to eat it. But I think it was because that they knew they grew it and that they helped process it and then they ate it, you know, and, you know, they still love eggplant to this day. Next slide. You know, food sovereignty, when you think about it, it's all encompassing, you know, how do we get people involved in the local food system? One way, getting people to grow it, teaching them how to grow, giving them understanding. Yeah, that's a good starting point, but people don't know at times what to do with kale. They don't know at times what to do with kohlrabi. They don't know at times what to do with just different vegetables that might be coming out. And so teaching them all the way around, whether you're teaching them how to process it, you're teaching them how to can it, or you're teaching them how to pick it, it goes into that cycle. Next slide. I know I'm getting lower on the time, but the Hoopa Valley tribe was able to purchase this mobile butcher unit, and this is actually we raise pigs at our home, and we actually, you know, our boys are actually the ones that feed them and take care of them, but we actually butcher them as well. So at this unit, we're able to hang hogs and we're able to butcher them right there, and we're actually able to process all of our own meat. So we make our own bacon, our own sausage and all that. And we actually involve our kids in all of that. Next slide. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
You know, the last slide that I want to leave with you guys is just sharing your gift. You know, I think that all of us have a gift to share within our tribal, you know, our homelands, but I think not only in our tribal homelands, but all over, you know, in Indian country, and sharing that gift is super important. So this slide right here, I just wanted to share is like on the left, we went to Del Norte, or basically the Smith River tribe up in Smith River, and we were able to help them do some stuff in their garden. But these are all the Hawaiian kids that came with us, and they were super helpful and got right in and they started helping plant up there. So they were like really good at, you know, rolling around a wheelbarrow and helping with a lot of the heavy work that was needed to be done there. And then there's my daughter on the right side. She's actually teaching another lady from a different tribe in California at how to braid bear grass. You know, sharing that gift is super important. But I'll let it go right there. And the last slide is just my contact information if you guys need it or want any more information of what I talked about today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. I loved looking at those photographs, so thank you for sharing those. We have our final presenter today, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end of our session for questions, so please use the Q&A feature at the bottom. Our next speaker is Cody Hendrickson. Take it away, Cody.
Yagali du, Echelon Cody Henriksen, Echelon Dena Ina e Sukpiak. Hello, my name is Cody Henriksen. I am Dena Ina and Sukpiak descent and enrolled member of the Ninilchik Village Tribe of Alaska. I'm a marine biology major and Native American studies major with a focus in Indigenous food sovereignty at HSU here. And I'm also an intern for Save California Salmon. And today I'm here to talk to you about the Food Sovereignty Lab. And I'm also a member of the steering committee for the Food Sovereignty Lab. And I'd also like to start out by stating that I'm in Wiyot territory in Arcata, or known as Gudini, meaning among the redwoods. And let's get started. All right. So today I'm talking to you about imagining an indigenized campus, what started out as a class project at HSU that has now come into fruition, that will be a lab, an actual physical space on the HSU campus. I'm going to talk about today its creation and some of our activism that led to our success of it being created too. Right here on the slide, I just have a picture of the Native American Forum on HSU, which is the location for Indigenous studies, presentations, and things of that nature. I'll be talking a little bit about the history of that building as well today. And so to start off, last fall, my Indigenous Natural Resource Management class at HSU imagined a project that would not just be like an end of the year like presentation we made. We wanted something that would actually have lasting impacts for our Indigenous populations on HSU's campus, because we actually have one of the largest, I believe we do have the largest Indigenous population of students in the CSU system. And so it's also important to mention that this project we developed was interdisciplinary, that it was made with classmates and teachers and mentors and advisors from all sorts of the colleges. And following the guidelines of participatory action research methodologies, we conducted interviews with HSU faculty, staff, and students to really learn how, what they imagined as an indigenized campus. Because originally this project just started off as like a project to interview people, Indigenous people with the school to see what they wanted as representation in their community and what they needed to be successful as students. And so this little diagram here I have is just about how we kind of developed the project and all the things that came from it that we'll be talking about today. So, in 2018, a research project investigating national public opinion about how non-natives perceive Native peoples stated that, quote, Native peoples are misrepresented and are now invisible in American society. Invisibility is in essence the modern form of racism and used against Native Americans. It is this invisibility that leads to a college access and completion crisis among Native American students. HSU currently is working to improve recruitment, enrollment, and retention rates. Our proposal of a food sovereignty lab would not only help strengthen our Indigenous food student body who are particularly vulnerable to these issues and suffer high rates of high incompletion rates. And it's something like this lab is not available to anyone. You know, there's nothing like this in the CSU system. And so our research questions really when we started this project were, what Indigenous representations do we have on CSU's campus? You know, what additions are essential to the Indigenous student body? And how can we grow these representations to better support our Indigenous community? So we actually ended up talking to numerous faculty, staff, and students and interviewing them and community members, mostly Indigenous, because we prioritized Indigenous voices on what they wanted to see in at HSU in the system. And so at HSU, current representations are services that support Native American students in chosen fields such as Intercept and ITEP. Presently, infrastructural and cultural representations on campus are very minimal, with some notable exceptions such as the Yurok-style traditional canoe in the library and the Native American Forum, which is a longhouse-inspired building used as a centralized space for Native American meetings and presentations. And while HSU will flaunt these programs and claim to support Native students, it's constantly cutting our programs, making accessibility problems, and making completion problems within our own department. Here's just a little list. It's not extensive or exhaustive of some of the resources and things you can find on campus, but it's really minimal. And there's even like, for me, there's something that is really quite offensive is there's a fake totem pole carved in the forest, like standing out in the forestry building. It's a chainsaw carving of a totem pole, which is a very sacred traditional thing for people of the Southeast Alaska and part of the First Nations in Canada. And it's just a gross misrepresentation of it. And so that's a pretty good idea of, you know, what Native students face at Humboldt, especially outside of our own department. And another part of our research was actually to look at current examples of indigenized CSU campuses. While they were minimal, some of the more notable, impressive representations we found were at Fresno State's Peace Garden, which consisted of 6 plants used in the making of Native American baskets and utilizes basket weaving pattern throughout the theme throughout the garden. And the Creekside Educational Garden at Chico State, which contains native species and signs which indicate common name, scientific names, and sometimes the Mechoopda name of those plants. In our research, we discovered that HSU's Food Sovereignty Lab would be the first of its kind in the UC and CSU school systems, and potentially even more nationwide. Another aspect of our research were to conduct 13 interviews with various faculty, students, and staff. And we also finally held a community stakeholders meeting to present our project proposal to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members of the community. This meeting gave our class the opportunity to put our community-based research skills to practice as we ran smaller and larger group discussions. Here I have our coded responses that we developed, and we developed this table based on those responses. The results show a strong desire for more ubiquitous Indigenous representation on HSU's campus utilizing diverse manifestations. And some of the most common responses were a food sovereignty lab, a unified cultural center, and a native plants garden with interpretive signage. And so really based on these findings and our class discussions, we really kind of developed this idea of a food sovereignty lab, a space that would be centralized permanent space for cultural baskets, such as basketry, regalia, and medicine, a space for traditional ecological knowledge workshops, Indigenous food preparation, and food sovereignty practices. And it's really supposed to be a place to enrich the student body, both through the production of foods and medicines, and also culturally and educationally. And in our proposal, this is not a space just for Indigenous peoples. It was actually meant to be interdisciplinary and add to multiple colleges within HSU and be accessible to all. But like any space, it was going to be a lab that you had to take the class for or to participate in. And internationally renowned Native American activist Winona LaDuke states that food sovereignty is an affirmation of who we are as Indigenous peoples, and one of the most sure-footed ways to restore our relationship with the world among us. And we really believe that this project would build that relationship. Here's a logic model created by one of our classmates that illustrates how our project will achieve that very goal through implemented curriculum and the integration of Indigenous pedagogies into multiple interdisciplinary colleges. This model explains our expected results based on our project proposal, our expected outputs, incomes, activities. And another very personal part of our research were actually personal testimonies from multiple Indigenous youth and leaders and teachers. And I'm here today to share mine with you. Growing up in Alaska, my childhood was filled with salmon, halibut, razor clams, moose, and wild berries. Yet after 100 years of assimilation and erasure, one of the last ways my family was able to, and tribe was able to remain traditional, was our subsistence lives. We are peoples who define ourselves by what we eat. Our lives are built around this very ideology, and it is our identity. When I left home to attend college at HSU for a degree in marine biology, I was forced to leave my traditional foods behind. Not only were my first few years of school marked with depression and anxiety, I'd also developed eating problems. I was on my own for the first time in a place I didn't know and without my family or the way of life I knew. It was here where I strayed from my traditions, and without the means or space to practice my food sovereignty, I'd never been farther away from my tribe. In Northern California, a place known for its rivers, salmon, and peoples, I had lost my connection to my salmon. It is the reason for this that the development of the Food Sovereignty Lab at HSU would be so integral to my education and career. And it's stories like this that were very common when we interviewed people. And, everyone we talked to said, traditional medicines and food. And so my story is not a very uncommon one, especially when you have students pursuing education that is distant from their traditional homelands. To bring back that knowledge to their tribe, it's still very detrimental to leave. And then you add on top of that changing your culture and changing the way you live your life and the foods you eat. It very much has huge impacts on student bodies. I struggled in school for years just because of my mental health. And that I very know is intricately linked to my Indigenous foods. And so we actually ended up taking our research to the CSU East Bay student-led research competition that's held annual, that highlights innovative student-led research within the CSU communities. And we actually did this virtually in COVID too. And we placed second in a graduate level behavioral sciences, and we actually won. We even got some prize money, and we donated it to the Food Sovereignty Lab. My associate, Carrie Tully, and I presented there, and it was a really great experience. But something that was really troubling was after we won, HSU put our faces all over every social media they had, congratulating us and praising us. Yet we had put forth a project proposal actually to have this program start and this lab start. And we even applied for a space that originally was designated as a space for the department, which I'll talk a little more about lately. But simultaneously, while they were praising us, we had been we were moving forward to create our plan, and a decision was made months before we were even notified about the denial of our space request for this. And they cited COVID, but it was actually months before any COVID closures happened. And the decision to deny our space really wasn't based on, the reasoning they gave us was that it wasn't an inclusive space, that it really wouldn't be for all. And quite literally, some of the first things we talked about in our application was that it was interdisciplinary for everyone who was willing to be a part of it. We even talked about involving communities, tribes, and organizations nationwide. So we actually applied for this space, which is known as the former Hilltop Marketplace, but this place was actually never designated to be a market. It was a market that had gone vacant, and we applied for it, and they denied us, saying that we weren't going to be for everyone. And I just want to give you a little To understand our frustration, you also just have to understand a little of the history of the BSS. So as we all know, HSU sits on Indigenous Wiyot land, and it was stolen and appropriated by settlers. And fast forward to 2007, HSU completed the construction of the BSS and Native American Forum. The design of the Native American Forum on the first floor of the BSS is modeled after a traditional house for Northwest California tribes. And one of the purpose for the BSS, the whole reason they were allowed to build it was that the first floor entirely and the Native American Forum was supposed to be entirely for the Native American Studies program. And this space that is pictured here on the left was actually designated to be a cultural workspace and Indigenous arts gallery. Then tribal leaders representing the Wiyot and Tolowa nations then came to bless the BSS in a ceremony, in a dedicated public ceremony. But before this cultural workspace could ever be used, it was reappropriated for a capitalistic endeavor, never meant to serve the students or academic needs. It was a space to sell actually, it was a space to sell junk food to us. It's pretty ironic what they ended up using it for. You know, and before the cultural workspace could ever be used, it got turned into this marketplace. And there's a traditionally inspired salmon smoking pit outside this building of the BSS that's never been used. There's a basement full of industrial grade kitchen equipment purchased for the lab that has been rusting for over a decade in the basement. The Hilltop Marketplace was a gross failure of the university, and when it couldn't make a profit, it ultimately closed, and the space remained vacant for over a year. In January of 2015, students were concerned about the designation and support for the Native American Forum, Native programs on campus, and the unjust firing of beloved Dr. Jacqueline Bowman, the then chair of HSU's Indian Natural Resource and Science Engineering program. Because of this, they occupied the Native Forum to call attention to how HSU celebrates and supports diversity. When protests ended with formal agreements between students and the university, Indigenous students were presented a letter by the president stating, "This stands as evidence of my commitment and that of other administrators working with Native American students and tribal nations regarding the historical and future plans for program funding, the utilization of space in the Native American Forum, and clear plans for how the space will be used in the future." Recently, our new president, President Jackson, came to CAFES, the California Indian faculty and staff, asked how HSU's campus and what Indigenous students wanted to see in our university. And, you know, we actually brought this forth, and we had to, in order to appeal, and this is where the activism part really came in, was once we figured out we were denied, we figured out the timeline for everything, and we started really finding that what we were being told wasn't true. We were being put into a bureaucratic loophole of, you know, dead ends, and essentially, you know, we had people telling us different stories. Oh, you have to apply through this way. You have to apply through this. You get the right to a hearing about it, or you don't. And we actually had to end up multiple students, and myself and our faculty advisor, Dr. Kutcha Riesling Baldley, started doing a lot of research and actually looked at the bylaws and laws of the Senate committee that was, that we had a right to actually reapply for this space, or to request that our denial be moved aside. And we had to go in front of the HSU Senate over Zoom, mind you, because of COVID restrictions. And we had 5 people give testimonies that were students. We had Dr. Kutcha Riesling Baldley give a testimony, and we actually had a Wiyot tribal member as well. And we all testified to the history of this space and how the denial of it was really based in racial bias, and how traditionally at HSU, students Indigenous students are treated this way, as less than, as our needs not meeting basic student needs, as being pushed aside. And after it was quite the meeting, because after all of our testimonies, we had a bunch of people, like the man that originally rescinded, denied us, all of a sudden pops up on the Zoom meeting saying, oh, I put a motion to pass this through. And then came the really interesting part of a classic story I'm sure many of us are used to, but we had all these senators speaking up saying, oh, like, I believe this is right, but we can't do this now. It sets a precedent. And, we had like so much bickering back and forth about process and about bureaucracy, when literally we had students, myself, like nearly tearing up, testifying about how important food sovereignty is to us, and about how important our education is, and how we need to, how those are not separate. And, it's so vapid when you have people arguing about policy and process when you're worried about your livelihood. At that time, I was waiting once a week for food deliveries from HSU's food programs. Not HSU's, it's actually a private club that was giving away food baskets. I was waiting in line for over an hour a week, when I gave this testimony. And actually, we're really fortunate, and through our activism after testifying and a lot of bickering, they did some weird loopholes so that we wouldn't disrupt their process, but they eventually approved us because we called them out on their racial bias. And but moving forward, we are now developing a steering committee around the Food Sovereignty Lab. And over the next 2 years, we'll be focusing on planning and the development of this lab. And it will include outreach, strategic planning, budgeting, fundraising, location remodel, equipment installation, policy and resolution, writing adoptions, all that good stuff. But really, it will be a committee made of students and people really involved locally with food sovereignty, organizations like Padawa, Community Garden, Blue Lake Rancheria is involved. We have just quite an amazing array of people we're gathering. And really, it's just going to be about planning the utilization of the space, developing curriculum, and inviting people in. And if you are interested in joining and being a part of this, I urge you to please contact Dr. Kutcher-Riesling-Baldley, and I can share that information as well. But the next step really in our projects now is applying for funding. And once we have secured the funding, we will design the space and purchase materials. But the reason we as students really felt this integral to us was because the nature of this is really so dedicated to our identities as people. I'm a salmon people. When I talk about myself, I talk about my food. That is how we as Native peoples consistently define ourselves all across the world. And the concept of food sovereignty directly relates to the building of individual and community resilience while preparing us for climate change. Because of the intense impact of COVID-19, it's really clear that there's a deep-rooted need for change, especially focusing around food systems. A focus on community-based collaboration, education, research, and work is apparent and essential. Our Indigenous student body at HSU and our community are telling us what they require for success, and now it really is time to listen. And with a food sovereignty lab on campus, what we really hope is to able to interact Indigenous ontologies so that students will be able to leave academia and advance into their careers with an understanding that everything really is connected. Also, this edition will set up a precedent for schools in California across the nation, focusing on the integration of colonial practices, which will only further the health of us all. We are in a time of global crisis, unlike anything we've ever faced, and therefore we are faced with problems of food and resources scarcity. And one thing I would like to leave you with today is in relation, to current times, an example I can give was smallpox. Smallpox originated as cowpox in cattle. And smallpox has, as we all know, has decimated indigenous communities all across the world. And this disease found in cattle changed over to smallpox. And it really did that because cattle were living in such poorly managed food systems that this disease was able to develop. And that's really my presentation today. Chikanik, thank you so much for your time. And what I'd like to leave you with is one of my favorite Denaina sayings, which is Nagi Ndeninyu, which means the tide is coming in. And what it really means is that good things are happening and you can't really stop it. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Cody. I hope all of you, everybody can virtually join me in thanking our amazing speakers today. Thank you all so much. We are at the end of our time, but we have a couple of questions that I think could be answered very quickly if our panelists wouldn't mind sticking around for like a few extra moments. One question, how is salmon preserved without glass jars? One of our audience members is curious.
Well, we smoke it until it's all the way dry, and then we just store it in, we do it in like freezer bags, or we'll put them in Silomil bags and stuff. So we smoke it all the way to dry.
I know for my people, traditionally, we do long, thin strips that we smoke till they're very much dry. And traditionally, we would have stored them in underground cellars that stayed cool because of permafrost and things like that. But nowadays, we Ziploc them and freeze them. But
great, thank you. And then we have another. We'll just do one more question before we end today's panel. There's a few folks interested in trade networks that you brought up, Hillary, and they wanted to know if you could say a little bit more about the introduction of new foods and the processes through which that happened, and was it customary with intertribal marriage to provide to bring them foods? And they're curious about the food networks and trade networks.
Right. So first of all, again, where I was talking about tribes, we're never static, like just stopped, right? Even though when we look at like federal Indian policy, it's like we got stuck in time. But traditionally, people grouped and regrouped at these trade networks. There would be folks that came to trade and would marry. So you'd marry, somebody from like, well, I'm a product of relocation. So my parents, Pomo and Paiute, but going back in time would be similar, right? So like another tribal member, a Hoopa person comes down and trades and they meet somebody and you bring the foodways of that area. The same thing when the Klamaths, when they say they used to steal the women, they'd come down to California, steal the women and take them up to Solilo to trade and that, we brought with us the ability to make our beautiful baskets and the ability to use the acorns like we do. So you look at the archaeological sites under what are inundated now, all these sacred places, right? So Lilo Falls, there's evidence of preparing acorns there, different ways, not only just leaching, but also digging the hole right by the river and leaving it in the gravel just to leach out. So, as we become more, almost the intertribal is very traditional because we have the taboos against, marrying a relation. So when we married out, people became historically part of the tribe, and so, as foods come in, and then with the hierarchy of our tribes, like maybe the chieftain might have more access to, like as Megan was talking about the dentalia and stuff, so they could be able to trade maybe inland for like the bigger elk, the bigger deer, because we got this coast, the smaller animals here. So everything's dynamic, it's always changing. You know, just the resilience of tribal people, you know, when we weren't allowed to leave the reservation, when our men were vilified and had to seek a pass to leave and weren't able to have a gun or have any kind of firearms or any kind of weapons because they were trying to control us. We became resilient even with our foods that ended up, some of, you know, making us sick, like the food commodities, the flour and all that stuff. But you know, as myself as a provider and you know, Noah's a hunter and a fisherman too. When our old people, especially with COVID, right, when they get sick, or the people in nursing homes, they always want traditional food. It's like at that time, they're always seeking what's going to help me, right? What you know, almost like a religious covenant of what is going to not just heal me, but heal everything. What is the right way, right? So always trading, always sharing. You know, we probably don't think of it as food related, but when we go visit somebody and we share, right? So you're going and visiting maybe the next tribe over, or you're at a doings, you're at a hand game tournament, maybe you're at a, you know, even today, right? You're at a fast pitch tournament, you go inland and you're sharing the food. I mean, that's very traditional, even though some people don't look at it that way. We're still going forward and we're changing. And, you know, I just purchased a dehydrator. And so, but, you know, I haven't really used it that much, but what does that, you know, our old people, of course, if they had blenders, they would have used it for acorns, you know, just, we use technology as it comes in and we retain, that's how we, you know, we have that resilience to withstand all these terrible things that happen to us, you know. We have to learn from the past and also, you know, be stronger in the future and be bold.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. This was a wonderful session. To all of the folks in the audience, a final reminder, please fill out your evaluation forms, and this lecture will be posted on YouTube. So if you're doing the certificate program with a buddy and they missed it, make sure they go to YouTube and watch it. And thank you all, and we'll see you next Friday. Have a good one.